Hello everyone. Welcome to the audio lecture on the principles of design. Now, every time an artist sits down to create a work of art, they're really faced with infinite choices. Where do you put the focal point? Where do you have the areas of highest contrast? How to draw the eye through the painting? Now, while much of this is intuitive and artists sort of know which way to go, there are guidelines to help in the process. When we look at it in relation to a two-dimensional composition, like a painting or a drawing, this is usually called composition. But there's a more broad term, which is that term of design. And that basically means how objects or images are put together to create either a pleasing or striking work of art. Now, ideally, the artist has something in mind and consciously chooses to guide the viewer's eye through the piece, or consciously chooses to make a point. And this is why we do have guidelines to follow. Now, in this chapter, we're going to look at several of the principles of design. But first, let's talk about what you already know. Everyone has an innate sense of what feels right and what doesn't feel right, something that feels harmonious or not. And that's something to notice as you go through your day. If you walk into a room and it feels essentially pleasing to you, can you figure out why? It's a good thing to investigate. Now, since they are a natural part of our perception, perhaps this will be easy and intuitive for you to learn. But just in case you don't know it all yet, let's start with the basic principles. Number one, unity and variety. Now, this is pretty straightforward, right? Unity. This means a unified design, where on some level the parts come together to create a whole. And variety? Well, it's the spice of life. That's when there's enough differentiation in there so that it's interesting. All right, so this first piece is kind of obvious, a little bit of both. You see how they've repeated these faces, and yet each one is a little bit different. And they have variety in the forms also as they come together. Let's look at a piece that is familiar to everyone. In fact, it always gets the most chosen when we do our first discussion and you show me a piece of art that is meaningful to you. And of course, this is Van Gogh's Starry Night. Now here we have both unity and variety, as well as rhythm or repetition of form. Now as we study this image, I'd like you first to notice the church steeple, which you could really even not notice when you look at it. Now notice how that same pointed form is repeated in the shape in the left of the foreground. You know what's also interesting about that shape in the left of the foreground is that we can't really tell what it is, but it's also maybe not necessary to know. Perhaps it's a bush or a stylized tree, but it serves to bring the eye back into the sky and to draw us through the composition. Oh, but we're talking about unity and variety. So look at the sky. I'm sure you can see the unity there. See the repeating sort of star planet shapes? Okay, variety. We have the swirl, we have the moon on the right, and yet it all works together, the variety, to create this unified composition, which is actually one of the greatest works of all time. Now we'll see also that unity and variety do go hand in hand with rhythm, and here we have unity and variety in architecture. Notice the circles that are at the top between the arches. You see, that adds a variety to the Gothic arch shape that we're seeing repeated down this hallway, down these arches that are from a mosque. Now let's look at one that is, well, quite frankly, just a little odd, if you must know. Now you tell me, is this odd? What does it tell you? I have no idea, but I think if I were to summarize this painting, I think I would call it Dancing at the End of the World, perhaps. So here we have on the right the ballroom dancers and the guy with the umbrella that's kind of keeping them from the rain. Okay, that's a singular composition. And then on the left you've got, the usual, a couple of fellas in hazmat suits moving a barrel around, and there's some kind of a ship in the distance. So what we have here is a great variety, like an extreme variety in the composition. And it's almost not workable because it's two completely different compositions. But I'll tell you what makes it work. Look at the dancer, the male dancer, and you see how he is looking at the hazmat fellas? So that one thing is what makes this work, right? So that's an example of unity and variety. And as you can see, all the principles are often found in a singular composition, but we just want to look at them a little more deeply here. Balance. Now, we all need balance in life, but you know, if you get too much balance, or if there's no tension involved whatsoever, it could be just a little bit boring. So let's look at a couple of kinds of balance, and you will need to know these terms. So this is Osamu Noguchi. Noguchi is a very famous sculptor and one that you would benefit by knowing. If you do go to the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, you can go see a beautiful display of Noguchi's work, which is in the new wing of the museum. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Here we have the red cube. Now this is I just think it's an amazing work of art because we do see balance, but it's balance in a way that seems very precarious, and yet it is all aligned on a central axis. So what this does in the environment that it's in is it brings a sense of sort of off balance almost into the courtyard of these tall buildings that are very unified and very repetitious in their architecture. So within the concept of balance, we have a couple different kinds of balance. One, symmetrical balance. What does symmetrical balance mean? Symmetry. Here's one to write down, okay? Symmetrical balance means evenly balanced on both sides of a composition. Now, as we can see in this piece by Georgia O'Keeffe, it doesn't have to be perfect balance, but you get a basic sense of this one being balanced. Now, I'll tell you an interesting story about this particular painting. You know, Georgia O'Keeffe was a great revolutionary woman artist of her day, and she was revolutionary in large part simply by being a woman, really, because she was around a lot of men in this upcoming field of modern art. And what she says about this painting in the documentary about her life, she says, "Oh gosh, all the guys were doing the great American painting, great American this, great American that." And she said, "Well, I'll just do my own great American painting. See the red, the white, the blue? This is it." So this is Georgia O'Keeffe's salute to the great American painting. And even if you didn't know that, it's quite pleasing. Now I want you to notice also that there's that black stripe down the center and the two red stripes on either side. They do tend to come forward. Do you see how the red kind of advances a little bit and the blue recedes? Well, that's the nature of color. Let's move on to radial design. Now, radial design is pretty similar, actually, to symmetric symmetry because it is the same on both sides, but in this case, it's the same all the way around. And here we have a mandala. Mandala means quite simply a circle. And it's an object often used for contemplation. We've already looked at the Tibetan Buddhist mandalas, which sometimes also tell sort of spiritual stories, like about their cosmology. But just to remind you, here's the monks hard at work, making their sand mandalas. And if any of you missed the videos, well, what do you think is going to happen to this beautiful work of art when they're all finished? It'll go right to the river. But meantime, you have a beautiful example here of radial symmetry. You could also look at it in terms of unity and variety, as you have these three individual people with a unified intention of completing this mandala and also using it as an expression of their spiritual practice. All right, so we have symmetry, we have radial symmetry, and we have asymmetry, which tends can be a little bit more towards chaos. This image is by one of the great masters of modernism, Vasily Kandinsky. And in here, it's a very off-balance, asymmetrical composition, as you can see. And yet there is something about it that works. Now, if I were to analyze it, I would say that the agitated lines on the right balance the circle on the left. And the fact that he's repeated the circle throughout actually is what makes it work. Because what you'll find is that anytime there's a circle within a work of art, the eye is drawn to that. It becomes the focal point. So because he has actually sprinkled all these circles in his painting, it keeps our eye from just landing in the upper left-hand corner and staying there. But you can see that that's also the focal point. Now let's look at one more on asymmetry. Okay, here's one of my favorite paintings of all time. And what you'll find is that there's lots of them. But this painting is by the artist Edgar Degas. And I'll tell you what I love most about this piece is that he has broken pretty much every rule of composition within it. You see how the figure is looking off to the right of the picture plane? Okay, we read from the left to the right. So anytime the composition goes off the right of the page, it's very hard to keep the viewer into the composition. But here he has balanced his very asymmetrical composition with this huge bowl of chrysanthemums. That's the title, Woman with Chrysanthemums. So what we have is a painting that really makes us sort of ask questions, and it draws the viewer in because the woman seems to be contemplating something. You know, she's really considering this. And we've already looked at this image in one of the early lectures when we were talking about what is art, and when we were talking about how each artist would portray the subject of a woman in a different way. Remember, and then Degas' woman, she's very thoughtful, and she seems almost intelligent, even in just from what we can see from this rendering. All right, so now we've covered balance, and we'll just move on. I'd like to add one more note about balance. And one of those, there's two notes actually, 2 pages that I want you to look at in your textbook in particular. Page 120, talking about the artist Georgia O'Keeffe, who we just looked at. And also I want you to look at the top of page 123, where they have these different principles of visual balance. This is especially important for those of you who are in the visual arts, who are painters, drawers, and designers. Those are very good to know, and you don't really need to memorize them so much as you need to get a sense of how these work in a composition. Before we move on to talk about emphasis and subordination, I want to draw your attention to this painting by Edouard Manet. Now this is a very interesting work because it was painted at a time in his life when he could no longer go to the bar. And he had sort of a jaded view of all of the partying that really the Impressionist painters did as a whole. By now he's an old man, and he's not well, and he paints this barmaid. And this is a very good example of asymmetrical balance. But I'd like you to all read the story about the painting that's on 126, and it talks about points of view and how people have read this painting throughout history and perhaps what the artist actually meant. You know, one of the things that I've learned about this image is that as part of him really being jaded by the whole scenario, the whole sort of Paris bar scene, if you look closely at this woman's eyes, she looks so sad. And she's here maybe asking this guy for a drink. I mean, maybe he's asking her for a drink. Maybe she's taking his order. Or who knows? You know, maybe he's asking her something else. But she looks like the life is kind of gone from her eyes and she's simply going through the motions. Now, what people have questioned through the years is the view. Like, why do we see this guy in the mirror, but we don't see him when we're looking at the woman? But that's one of the ways that Manet used his artistic license to create a powerful work of art. Now this completes the first half of the lecture. We've got a few more to go, so stay tuned and look for number 2 coming right up.